This is the Week in Sustainability from Sustain.Life. It's where our team of sustainability experts and practitioners share commentary to keep you up to date on developing stories and news.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Week in Sustainability. I'm Melissa Ray, the Chief Sustainability Officer at Sustain.Life, and I am joined today by Kate Holman, who leads our communication strategy and is the behind-the-scenes powerhouse of this weekly series, tirelessly editing our bloopers and sharing it across all of our different channels, across media and podcast. So, Kate, you want to share a little bit with our viewers, a bit more about your role at Sustain.Life?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Alyssa, for having me. Just to give you guys a quick, brief overview, I manage all the corporate messaging, external events, webinar series, media relations, and as also already mentioned, editing and producing this podcast. And so it's exciting to be on the other side this week.
Awesome. I love it. This is going to be a really fun one. I can already tell. So thank you for joining today. So this week, we are taking a bit of a political turn with our stories, and we'll be covering recent news about potential redistribution of the Inflation Reduction Act funds to causes that may not quite fit the bill for what you might have thought. And now that it's officially primary season, we're also going to do a quick overview of where each Republican presidential candidate stands on climate change.
Okay, so let's kick it off with the IRA. Our beloved 369 billion funding package to accelerate the energy transition and broaden decarbonization efforts across the US. There are actually two developments this week highlighting potential activities that these funds could be used to support. The first being the expansion of the highway infrastructure in Texas. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Alyssa, but it seems a little counterintuitive to the decarbonization goals that are underpinning this bill.
I would say so. So remember, IRA relies on a mix of funding strategies and deployments that, in portion, gives latitude to state agencies to essentially deploy funds for specific initiatives that meet certain qualifying characteristics. And so, what the Texas Department of Transportation has done is submitted their draft carbon reduction strategy that, amongst other things, allocates $112 million of IRA money to essentially expand highway infrastructure. And the logic that they're claiming of why this supports carbon reduction goals in the IRA is that the bigger the highway, the less congestion you have, the less idling you have, which of course does reduce emissions.
I mean, I guess that kind of tracks, but I have to agree with the critics of this plan. I think it's a pretty disappointing bare minimum attempt to secure funding that could be used to support like an actual transition away from fossil fuels, like expanding EV charging infrastructures, alternative fuels, and optimizing freight logistics. Like, I mean, especially in a state like Texas, where the transportation sector is the second biggest emitter after the industrial sector, with 215 million metric tons of CO2, according to EIA's most recent data.
Yes, and I'm with you, Kate. I would frankly be remiss if I didn't mention that nowhere in this proposed draft strategy did the agency include any mention of climate change or indicate any importance as to reducing carbon emissions to rein in climate change and extreme weather events. So it's a pretty clear indicator of where they stand on the topic.
Well, speaking of a stance on a topic, let's shift our story to the Republican presidential candidates' views on climate change, which, if you watched the GOP primary debate, I know I did, may not be what you think. It honestly came to like a huge surprise to me that any actual candidate, in fact, believed in any sort of, of climate change.
I know. I felt like we were off to this really good start, but then it pretty quickly took a downfall. Only three of the candidates, Christie, Scott, and Trump, actually believe that humans are at least in part responsible for climate change. And before we get into the rest of this, because there's a couple of different stances that I know we want to share, I think it's actually important for us to anchor on the general party line that the GOP has taken over the past several years. So when it comes to climate action, the party generally takes a very protectionist lens. So promoting things like energy independence and reduced reliance on foreign sources through domestic production. And they also rely on a fair amount of finger pointing, often pointing that finger at China and India, two of the world's current largest emitters, to curb their actions rather than, of course, focusing on the US, which is still in that number two spot and number one slot for most historic total emissions.
So, I mean, it's not surprising that most candidates support an expansion of US energy sources for fossil fuels like oil and gas, but it's interesting to see an even more split across the field of candidates in regards to coal, with DeSantis, Haley, Scott, even Trump indicating no. There's only one candidate, Chris Christie, who supports a full renewable expansion across ethanol, hydroelectric, solar, and wind.
Well, yeah, and he may support renewables, but he doesn't support the U.S. commitment to the 2015 Paris Accord. Of course, the landmark global agreement of 200 nations to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in order to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. And in fact, not one candidate indicated support for the U.S.'s continued participation in that accord. And going back to our first story on the IRA, and this one is really crazy because, as we know, the red states have received the lion's share of IRA funding benefits. Not one candidate voiced support for the IRA's incentives for domestic clean energy production, electric vehicle manufacturing, and electrification, with Haley, Scott, and Trump going so far as to say that they would actually repeal it.
This is like one of the hardest pills for me to swallow personally because it just goes against the numbers. Of the $280 billion investments made within the year since its passing, the vast majority of the funds have gone to Republican held districts.
I know. It's actually to me like such a clear and tragic politicalization of climate. And it does such a disservice not only to our planet, but to our economy. And it double doesn't make sense because given the GOP's stance on energy independence, it just makes no sense to then oppose the actual funding of factories and infrastructure that allows us to achieve that energy independence. Well, that one really gets under my skin. It just actually makes no sense and is so frustrating and just to me calls attention to the entire political circus that is maybe what our reality has become
It's
today.
wild.
All right, folks. Well, that is what we have for you today. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we will see you next week for another week in sustainability.
Sustain.Life is the leading and most comprehensive sustainability software on the market. To learn how we can help your company measure its emissions and take climate action, go to Sustain.Life. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this show on our YouTube channel or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for tuning in. See you next week.